In the previous video, we went over how different factors in a damage environment can change how endgame players create optimal damage strategies in Destiny 2. In this video, we're going to apply that knowledge and discuss the most important building blocks for structuring a team around any damage scenario. While this section doesn't have nearly as many elements as the previous video, it's still very important to become very familiar with these core damage components in order to achieve the best boss damage outcomes for your team. Welcome to part 2, Team Structure. First up on our team checklist is debuffs. Debuffs can be applied to bosses in a variety of ways and will cause them to take increased damage from all sources. On top of this, they cannot be stacked, and the most potent debuff will always take priority. Debuffs also fall into two categories: standard debuffs and void weaken effects, introduced with Void 3.0 in Season of the Risen. While for most purposes, weakens can be treated as 15% standard debuffs, there are some bosses that can only be weakened and not debuffed, notably Aatrax from Deepstone Crypt. While it is unknown why this is the case, some players have theorized that it has to do with Aatrax being one of many bosses using proxy entities in order to have multiple damageable instances, much like Crypt Security from the same raid and Fallen Shield from Grasp of Avarice. The most common debuffs used in optimal damage strategies are Tractor Cannon and Deadfall Tether, while less common debuff options include Divinity, Mobius Quiver, Felonier's Helm, Echo of Undermining, Collective Obligation, and seasonal debuff options. Based on some of the considerations we went over in the last section, the debuff you choose might change. By default, most optimal damage setups opt for Tractor, as it is the only reapplicable 30% debuff in the game that does not require a super. On top of this, Tractor users can still do a sizable amount of damage while still keeping full debuff uptime, compared to an option like Divinity, where the debuff player is resigned to exotic trace rifle damage for the entire phase. This sounds great, but if Tractor is so great and all, with its 10-second debuff, insane total debuff uptime and reserves, handling boost, ability to hit immune targets, update health, and do good damage with specials, then why would you ever not use it? Let's talk about some scenarios where it might not make sense to use Tractor by analyzing its disadvantages. First, Tractor Cannon is a shotgun, and shotguns don't have much range. If a boss is very far away or impossible to reach with its blast, then it's simply not an option. For example, players choose to use Deadfall Tether, the next most common debuff, on the Sanctified Mind, because they are encouraged to stay by the non-tethered relay in order to make use of enhanced relay defender mods. If the Tractor player were to try and debuff, they would not be able to reapply the debuff mid-damage without leaving the relay and dropping their damage to almost nothing. Second, while it's not a massive difference, Tractor does decrease the amount of damage players do compared to just doing damage normally. Typically, in 6-man damage scenarios like raids, this isn't an issue, and the exchange of one player's damage for a 30% boost to everyone else is acceptable, especially when you consider the length of some raid damage phases where a tether won't cut it. However, in scenarios where you have less players, having a player use Tractor instead of Deadfall Tether, Mobius Quiver, Felwinners, or some sort of weaken can actually end up being damage loss, especially on bosses where the typical Tractor double shotgun damage method isn't very effective to begin with. Finally, sometimes debuff options are chosen for a utility purpose, something that Tractor may not have, as versatile as it is. For example, Divinity is often chosen in Fireteam Grandmaster Nightfall speedruns as its instant hit scan, practically infinite range overload stun, and massive crit are more useful than Tractor's higher debuff percentage and reserves. Another example, Tractor Cannon occupies the power ammo slot, and while it is very useful, there are times where other weapons take priority. In King's Fall speedruns, for example, teams choose to use Divinity on Daughters, despite Tractor Cannon being a usable debuff on the boss models in question. Why? During the encounter, there is a floater player on a sword with He Rises, meaning that no matter what they do, their damage won't be as high as the other players, who are on damage supers or touch a flame with rockets. This player, assigned the role of debuff, has two choices: dunk the brand and swap to Tractor, wasting precious seconds on a kill that's already below 10 seconds, or run Divinity the entire time, provide a slightly weaker debuff, but remain on a sword and provide a huge crit for the team for that short damage window. This thought process is how the previous video connects to this one. Damage environments are never isolated. There are always considerations that surround decision making when it comes to choosing what to do for damage. A big part of optimizing damage in Destiny is learning what is available at your disposal, including these debuff options, and then understanding why or why not you might choose to use them based on the circumstances you are given. All debuffs have their downsides and upsides, and range, debuff percentage, duration, ease of use, damage potential, and setup time can all play a factor in determining each debuff's viability. On the other side of things, we have buffs. Global buffs are quite similar to debuffs in many regards, with the only major difference being that they almost exclusively affect weapon damage, with the exception of Marksman Golden Gun. By far, the most common buffs used in optimal damage setups are Well of Radiance and Radiant, as they are both extremely easy to use and give a 25% buff, which is good enough for most damage scenarios. Other buffs that are less frequently used include Empowering Rift and Blessing of the Sky, sourced from Lumina or Boots of the Assembler. While buffs used to be much more diverse, the removal of Charge with Light mods from the game in Lightfall simplified them greatly by doing away with specialized options like Loosened Blade and Argent Ordnance, as well as High Energy Fire. Much like debuffs, optimal buffs are also dictated by the previously discussed considerations. While Well of Radiance is the de facto standard, as most Destiny players are no doubt aware, there are some scenarios where it isn't necessarily the best option, much like Tractor Cannon. Let's analyze Well the same way we did Tractor, by looking at its downsides. First, Well is stationary. Normally that's not so bad, but there are situations where that can be problematic. For example, the Consecrated Mind begins its damage phase right next to a relay, but retreats backwards into the middle of the map, at which point a wall closes off the damage start location. As a result, unless 2 wells are placed, players will be forced to walk out of the initial well and lose their damage buff if they want to keep doing damage. Instead of having 2 players on well, which is either damage loss or impossible based on class composition, optimal damage strategies often only involve 1 well, at most, on top of Radiant from Ember of Torches. While damage is typically thought of as a static activity, I did mention in the first video that I'd also be covering other scenarios like Nightfalls and Sectors. In these scenarios, Well's stationary state is even more problematic. You're not going to have a well to plop down in every room you go into in a GM, and you're certainly not going to have one during most of a sector. For these mobile situations, Radiant in conjunction with Empowering Rift is plenty to keep up damage on champions and bosses. Second, Well costs a super, one that could be used on damage. Much like with Tractor, if a phase is short and there are less players in the fireteam, it might make more sense to get a damage buff some other way, so that the Warlock in question can use a super like Needlestorm or Cataclysm Nova Bomb instead. By extension, maybe a Warlock isn't even an option. After all, Well is exclusive to Warlocks. In these cases, generally Radiant is the go-to buff option. Finally, Well's damage buff is only 25%. While there are not many damage buffs above 25%, there are times when it makes sense to shoot for higher. The only really relevant damage buff above 25% is the 35% provided by Blessing of the Sky, most often from Lumina's Noble Rounds. Options like Banner Shield sacrifice too much damage, but Lumina and Boots of the Assembler strike a good compromise for the benefit they provide in a damage strategy. In the case of Lumina, the cost is not being able to run another exotic weapon like Izanagi's Burden or the Fourth Horseman. However, with how powerful our legendary damage options have become, even using just a rocket and abilities for damage is often barely any damage loss, so providing the rest of your teammates a 10-second boost over Well can be worth it for short phases. Be cautious though, the longer a phase drags on, the worse Lumina becomes, since eventually you run out of noble rounds to buff your teammates with. In the case of Boots of the Assembler, the cost is not being able to use a damage-related exotic like Ophidian Aspect. While this isn't really a big deal, there's another quirk to Boots of the Assembler which might explain why it isn't used frequently in damage strategies. Unfortunately, Noble Seekers spawned from Assembler Rifts do not target players who are in a Well of Radiance, meaning that said players have to receive the buff early before entering the well. The logistics of this process play out a lot more inconveniently compared to Lumina, but for what it's worth, this option is quite underrated and a little neglected by endgame players, often not even crossing people's minds when they come up with damage strategies. The release of Lightfall affected the damage stacking structure in Destiny drastically, and while it did reduce the number of buffs to choose from, what it really impacted the most was Amplifiers. Amplifiers are modifiers that boost damage beyond a single buff and debuff. Before Lightfall, we had Font of Might, Power of Rasputin, exotic exclusive buffs like Light Shift, activity mods like Transcendent Blessing, and seasonal mods like Solo Operative. In Year 6 of Destiny, this system has been greatly simplified and condensed, which makes this component of damage a lot easier to understand, albeit less interesting. With the removal of Warmind cells, Power of Rasputin is no longer a factor. Font of Might and exotic buffs have both been merged and converted into weapon surge mods, which are now subclass independent and based on armor charge, scaling mod count with damage instead of duration. What does this mean for a Year 6 player? Besides activity and seasonal mods, the only thing that players need to keep track of is surges now. Stacking up to 4 times, surges provide bonuses of 10% to 25% to a single weapon affinity, regardless of slot. Theoretically, it is possible to have 4 surges of every single weapon affinity active at once, but realistically, players doing damage will only have access to 3 total surges across 1 to 2 weapon affinities, since that's all leg armor mod slots permit. Having surges on for damage is a no-brainer, but which surges do you pick? Technically speaking, you can do the math to find out exactly how you should assign your 3 surge choices based on a little proportional problem solving, but generally players will run either 3 surges matching their power weapon affinity, or a 2-1 split between their power weapon affinity and kinetic weapon surge. In a situation where a power weapon absolutely dominates the total damage pie chart that a player is outputting, like in the case of clown cartridge rockets or linear DPS, it makes more sense to run 3 of 1 surge. In other situations where players might be running Double Slug or Izanagi's Burden in conjunction with their power weapon, it makes more sense to distribute surges more evenly instead of taking the diminishing returns from 17% to 22%, going from 2 to 3 surges. While most players are familiar with the idea of weapons influencing surge choice, it is also important to acknowledge the reverse. Because it is optimal to run only 2 surge types at most through leg mods, players are also incentivized to choose energy weapons that match their power weapon's affinity, so that one of the surge mods is doing double duty. For example, players using Apex Predator may opt for Sojourner's Tail or Empty Vessel, instead of other alternatives like Ness's Ablation or Truth Teller in a swap rotation. While this kind of loadout influence is nowhere near as restrictive as it was prior to Lightfall, where weapons and subclasses had to match for Font of Might, it is still something worth thinking about when trying to push for damage optimization. 2 more things about amplifiers I'd like to touch on from earlier. First, it is possible to reach 4 surges of an affinity, but only through exotic assistance. While these exotic exclusive buffs used to provide their own unique amplifiers which stacked with everything, as a result of the Lightfall merge, they no longer stack with the standard leg surge mods. Where exotic options like Mask of Bakras used to provide a unique benefit by amplifying damage to targets affected by stasis, on top of providing a stackable arc weapon damage boost, they now provide 4 of both the arc and stasis surges instead. This segues into the second note on exotic amplifiers. While some options were worsened by the surge conversion, some exotics received changes that made them interesting potential options for use in damage scenarios. Of all of them, Sanguine Alchemy is probably the one most worth examining. When standing in any rift, including Wells, this exotic provides 2 surges matching the subclass of the user for free, allowing you to dedicate all 3 of your leg surges to another affinity, most likely kinetic. Assuming your kinetic and subclass matched weapons do about the same damage, this amounts to about a 5% increase in overall damage. While it may not seem like much, if an exotic like Verity's Brow isn't needed for damage, Sanguine Alchemy is a great neutral option that boosts damage for free, provided you have your surges configured correctly. Subclass verbs like Jolt and Shatter applied through perks like Volt Shot and Chill Clip or abilities like Gathering Storm also play a small role in damage setups, but we'll delve further into this topic when we discuss the current meta in Part 4. Finally, as mentioned in Part 1, depending on the activity or season at hand, certain restricted amplifier mods may be valuable. For example, Transcendent Blessing and Riven's Curse are used extensively in Dreaming City damage environments, and Thunderous Retort is a valuable super augmentation mod from the current season's artifact. Exotics in Destiny provide unique benefits that range from quirky, almost aesthetic tweaks to meta-defining, gameplay-shaping changes. Over the course of Destiny's history, certain exotics have cemented themselves as essentials in damage scenarios, and we'll discuss their place in strategizing in this section. Let's start with Exotic Armor. Exotic Armor fills many functions that can affect damage, but nearly all of them fall into the same major categories: weapon uptime, ability amplification, super augmentation, and utility. Weapon uptime refers to exotics that boost stats that improve the effectiveness of weapons. Lunafaction boots boost reload and range significantly, which is especially important for shotgun damage. Ophidian Aspect boosts handling and reload. Rain of Fire reloads all weapons on a short cooldown. The Dragon's Shadow does the same thing, but on a long cooldown while massively boosting handling. Radiant Dance Machines provide rapid true reloads, which can trigger effects like Clown Cartridge. Finally, Speedloader Slacks provide a 15-second Ophidian-style stat boost to all nearby allies upon a dodge. Ability Amplification is a class of exotics that boost ability damage and regeneration based on certain conditions. Since supers are in a separate category, this group contains exotics that boost grenade and melee damage significantly. For grenade-focused exotics, Heart of Inmost Light provides massive regeneration scalers and sizable damage boosts to the remaining 2 abilities when any ability is activated. Verity's Brow provides a massive 1000% boost to grenade regen to teammates on throw on top of doubling self-damage. Starfire Protocol provides 2 fusion grenade charges and grenade energy on empowered damage, and Young Ahamkara Spine boosts trip mine damage and provides grenade energy on ability damage. A special mention goes out to Sunbracers, which are typically thought of as an ad clear exotic but are currently capable of augmenting boss damage due to lava blobs emitted from Touch of Flame solar grenades stacking on a single target. Melee exotics are relatively uncommon in optimal Year 6 damage builds, having been neutered as a result of dominant 1-2 punch builds in Years 4 and 5, but the ones that were previously used include Syntheseps requiring 3 nearby enemies, Peregrine Greaves requiring airborne shoulder charge activation, and Winter's Guile and Wormgod's Caress, functionally the same exotic under the hood, both requiring rapid melee kills to reach a formerly high stacking bonus. Compared to the previous 2 categories, super augmentation is very straightforward. In fact, there are only 3 relevant super augmentation exotics at this current time in Destiny 2 history. Celestial Nighthawk, which is used for burst damage on precision targets, Curus of the Falling Star, which doubles Thunder Crash damage, and Star Eater Scales, the powerhouse of super exotics, single-handedly justifying the presence of hunters in optimal damage scenarios by boosting their super damage by a whopping 70%. Finally, we have the utility category. This category includes Boots of the Assembler and Felwinter's Helm, two exotics we've already mentioned as sources of buffs and debuffs in certain scenarios. I also thought I'd throw Foe Tracer in here, since it's used occasionally to really squeeze damage out towards the end of a boss health bar. While this might seem like a huge list of exotics to take in, rest assured that this list covers pretty much every damage scenario in Destiny 2. Another comfort is that the vast majority of damage scenarios in Destiny use the same couple exotics, which I'll describe briefly before we move on to weapons. Typically, damage strategies use only one Well, which has its user cast on Lunafaction boots and then swap to a more damage-appropriate exotic, combined with a host of exotics based on the class composition or boss type in the given environment. If a damage situation permits a lot of hunters, then it makes sense to have a lot of Star Eater Scales boosted blade barrages. If a boss is particularly susceptible to grenade damage, then Verity's Brow and Heart of Inmost Light will often come into play. If it seems best to damage a boss with mostly weapons, then strong neutral exotics that boost weapon uptime are best, like Ophidian Aspect, Rain of Fire, subclass permitting, and the Dragon's Shadow. While it's not easy learning how to adapt player exotics to damage environments, we will revisit exotics when we go over real examples of damage strategies in part 6 of this series. The last piece of the team structure puzzle is exotic weapons, which can be unique in a number of ways. While some exotic weapons provide some unique benefit to the user or team that assists in damage in some way, others are special in that they themselves are the major damage dealers in a player's loadout. The first category, which I'll name Utility, includes Lumina, Divinity, and Tractor Cannon, which we've already discussed as buff and debuff sources, as well as Gallarhorn, which boosts legendary rocket damage by 30% through the provision of Pack Hunter, and Parasite, which provides a 15% stackable bonus to your other two weapons via Worm byproduct. It comes as no surprise that the second category, exotics that are a step up over their legendary counterparts in actual raw damage, is a much broader one. Listing them all off, we have Bastion, noteworthy because of its high impact damage to object-based bosses, Izanagi's Burden, a renowned, extremely high burst sniper often used in damage rotations, Witherhoard, an auto-loading grenade launcher that provides constant damage ticks which are great for activating effects like Starfire Protocol's empowered damage requirement, Merciless, an excellent option for milking special-only damage in an ammo-limited situation, the Fourth Horseman, the energy shock and equivalent of Izanagi's Burden, Grand Overture, an extremely high single-weapon burst option, Legend of Acreus, an ammo-efficient close-quarters powerhouse, Parasite, a repeat appearance that also stacks up as the highest single-tick burst damage weapon in the game, and the Wardcliff Coil, which does huge damage to bosses that are classified as minors or majors rather than proper bosses. Similar to armor, outside of unique circumstances, most of the time you'll be using the same exotic weapons in Destiny 2 damage environments. Most weapon-oriented damage strategies in Year 6 involve 1 Gallarhorn, 1 Tractor, and 4 people or 1 person on legendary rockets, plus Izanagi's Burden or the Fourth Horseman. Even grenade-oriented damage strategies involve largely the same weapons on top of grenade throwing, with some modifications to make death throws refreshes more convenient if Verity's Brow is involved. As mentioned in the buff and debuff sections, throw in a Tractor or Lumina as needed, and the rest should follow. Team structure can be a complicated topic to approach for anyone, even amongst the most experienced Destiny strat crafters. Hopefully this video gave you a strong 4-5-part foundation with which to build damage strategies on, because you'll be needing it when we get to the second half of the series, where we'll be using these fundamentals non-stop. In the next part of this series, we're going to go over damage setup, as in now that everyone has the right stuff on, how do we get everything in place so that when damage starts, it all goes down smoothly. That's what we'll discuss in part 3.